Welcome to our study of the biblical poetry books. In this lesson, we will examine the book of Ecclesiastes, whose title means the preacher. Like the book of Job, Ecclesiastes is a wisdom dialogue, but it is delivered like a sermon and preached by King Solomon. Solomon is in his later years when he preaches the words in this book, and he is directing his message to the young men of Israel. In Psalm 127, Solomon says it is possible to worry in vain, to work in vain, and to build in vain. He returns to this theme in Ecclesiastes saying, "I spent most of my life in vanity. Don't you do it too?" Essentially, we are going to dive into how Solomon lived a mostly empty life, chasing worthless things and living ineffectively. In this sermon, Solomon preaches on purpose and meaning in three different areas of life. First, he explains how he sought purpose and meaning in material riches. He describes how he poured so much effort into fleeting things that never even mattered. Solomon goes on to speak a truth that can be hard to swallow, saying that everybody is headed to the grave, regardless of whether they are rich or poor. He realizes he exhausted himself by seeking possessions only to leave them to someone else who didn't work for any of it when he dies. Perhaps he was thinking of his son, Rehoboam, who he knew would be a foolish leader. Why did he work so hard to become rich, only to pass it on to someone who would waste it? Second, Solomon describes how he dedicated himself to the pursuit of knowledge and wisdom. He declares in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 16, "I have magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has observed a wealth of wisdom and knowledge." Solomon reveals that he did not find the purpose or the meaning of life in either of these things, and that they don't always lead to happiness. Why? Because nobody can escape death, and no amount of knowledge or wisdom can stop it. Many say ignorance is bliss, but even though Solomon learns that wisdom and knowledge have their limits, he is not interested in the contentment that comes from ignorance. He says in chapter 2, verse 13 through 14, "I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness." He adds in chapter 2, verse 26, that to a person who is good in his sight, he, meaning God, has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. Solomon tells the young men of Israel that he tried a third route to finding purpose in his life. He sought worldly pleasure. Solomon says in chapter 2, verse 10, "All that my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure." The man who indulged in every bit of fun and entertainment that he could find admits in the end, according to Ecclesiastes 7, that it is better to go to a funeral than a party. This is because the person who goes to a funeral is forced to contemplate his or her own coming death. They are forced to think of eternity and evaluate his or her life. For the person who wastes away their days partying, all their pleasure will soon vanish and hold no value in eternity. Solomon warns in 7:6, "For as the crackling of thorn bushes under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool." Having spent so much of his time and energy chasing wealth, wisdom, and pleasure, Solomon tells the young men in chapter 12, verses 13 through 14, the conclusion when all has been heard is, "Fear God and keep his commandments," because this applies to every person. For God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. Believing in and following God will shape you into the person God designed you to become. Meaning and purpose are not invented, and they are not found within ourselves. Real meaning and purpose are discovered when we acknowledge God and seek Him in order to live out His will. As you read through the book of Ecclesiastes, you will discover that a wisdom dialogue presents its truth in a whole package, so to speak. While reading, you have to discern struggles from answers and arguments from final truth. Solomon is transparent. He is open and honest about his doubts, old and new, as he takes the reader on a journey of discovery. This journey moves through Solomon's losses and gains as he shares his experiences. He talks of his hard labor and his reward. He shares feelings of hopelessness. He talks about ignorance, self-centeredness, and humility. He has experienced much and teaches wisdom from this perspective. In Ecclesiastes, God permits Solomon to express everything, both his skepticism and his faith. Some of the wisdom nuggets you find in the book of Ecclesiastes have more weight behind them because they are spoken in light of his once foolish decisions. The art of learning from Ecclesiastes, like all wisdom dialogue, comes through discernment. We must be able to know which parts of the text are meant for discussion and which parts are solutions and truths. In chapter 3 and 11, Solomon wisely writes these well-known words: "To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to pluck what is planted, a time to kill, and a time to heal. He has made everything appropriate in its time." One of the great lessons we gain through Solomon is this: simple answers to complex questions are often foolish. They lack some sort of substance. Christians can easily tend to approach every issue in life as either or, but a wise person knows that many things in life are often both and. Another way of saying this is that not everything is black and white. In life, there are a lot of gray areas. Statements like "God always wants you to be healthy and wealthy" are clear misinterpretations of complex statements. We must be willing to dive a little deeper. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 verse 11 also records another helpful piece of wisdom, saying that God has also set eternity in their heart, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. Many like to speak about a God-shaped hole that is inside the heart of every person. This hole cannot be filled with anything but God. Every attempt that people make to find satisfaction in this world leaves that missing part of them still yearning for something more. We were made to dwell with our Creator forever. When this is missing from our life, we are dissatisfied with anything that the world could ever offer us. We find an almost ironic statement by Solomon in Ecclesiastes chapter 4 verse 8, which says, "There was a certain man without a dependent, having neither a son nor a brother. Yet there was no end to all his labor. Indeed, his eyes were not satisfied with riches, and he never asked, 'And for whom am I laboring and depriving myself of pleasure?' This too is vanity, and it is a grievous task." There are many reasons why people work. Most work to provide necessities like food and shelter for themselves and for their families. Some find a sense of purpose in their work, providing something meaningful for their community. This right kind of work has been part of God's plan for us all along. According to Genesis 1 and 2, humans were made to work. A life without labor leaves a person dissatisfied and restless. To take it further, a person with no task could easily fall into corruption or temptation. Then, there are those who find their sole identity in their work and neglect all other meaningful parts of life. Neither laziness nor worshiping our work are God's intention for us. Whatever it may be, Solomon wants to address both the problem and the solution in light of dedication to the Lord. Moving on to the topic of relationships, Solomon offers more wisdom. In chapter 4, verses 9 through 12, we are given a beautiful insight into friendship and family. He writes, "Two are better than one, because they have a good return for their labor. For if either of them falls, the one will lift up his companion. But woe to the one who falls when there is not another to lift him up. Furthermore, if two lie down together, they keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? And if one can overpower him who is alone, two can resist him. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly torn apart. A threefold cord is not quickly broken." This is a great spiritual metaphor. God meant for human beings to be a part of meaningful community. We are not made to just have animal-like relationships. Animal relationships rarely go beyond anything physical. Instead, God designed the marriage relationship between a man and a woman to create a oneness of spirit. With God at the center, a marital union forms that strong 3-cord rope we just referenced. God planned that we should have communion in our marriages. He planned for physical, spiritual, and intellectual relationships to be part of such a union. This type of design is simply beautiful. Solomon gives some more good advice in chapter 7, verse 10. "Do not say, 'Why is it that the former days were better than these?' For it is not from wisdom that you ask about this." People are prone to nostalgia, dwelling on and wishing for things of the past. This causes many to live in frustration with the present. As believers, we must learn to develop contentment in the present. As Paul boasted in Philippians chapter 4, verses 11 through 12, I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. I know how to get along with humble means, and I also know how to live in prosperity. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. How did he do this? Part of the answer is found in Philippians 3, 13 through 14. One thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and reaching forward to what lies ahead, I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. The last chapter of Ecclesiastes begins with this beautiful verse. Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near, when you will say, I have no delight in them. Before this, in 11, 9 through 10, we hear an almost sarcastic encouragement. Rejoice, young man, during your childhood, and let your heart be pleasant during the days of young manhood, and follow the impulses of your heart and the desires of your eyes. Yet know that God will bring you to judgment for all these things. So remove grief and anger from your heart and put away pain from your body, because childhood and the prime of life are fleeting. What follows is a sad but beautiful poem about growing old, falling apart, and dying. A person is taken out of this world, leaving everything here behind, and their spirit returns to God. This idea connects to what Solomon was preaching to the young men, warning them to only chase things of eternity. A famous Christian martyr once said, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." As we close, let us reflect on this. Ecclesiastes is a wonderful and complex sermon from an old king delivered to the young men of Israel. As you read, picture Solomon offering these words of wisdom. Keep in mind that at the time he was the richest man who had ever lived, the wisest man who had ever lived, and the man who had experienced more worldly pleasure than anyone else. You can almost hear him saying something along these lines. Listen, experience has convinced me. Let my experience convince you. Remember your Creator always, even when you are young. For my entire life, I sought to find the meaning and purpose of life in riches, knowledge, and pleasure, but the answers were nowhere to be found. Let me save you some time and heartache and tell you where the meaning and purpose of life can be found. In fearing God and keeping His commandments all the days of your life. He is the only thing that will fill the void in your heart.